I will be presenting the first part of this talk, and then my colleague Iskander will be presenting the following part. So this is a joint work between EURECOM, a university in the south of France, and Norton LifeLock, and we will be talking about web tracking. So web tracking is a very hot topic nowadays. There are a lot of studies that try to investigate tracking techniques and how organizations are collecting information from the user. There are also studies that try to measure how prevalent web tracking is on the web. For example, there was a study of 2 years ago that by crawling the top 1 million websites concluded that, for example, Google and Facebook are present in 40% and 18% of them. The main research question of our work is that what does this mean for the user? So what about the user perspective of web tracking? For example, does the fact that Google or Facebook are present in 40% and 18% of the top 1 million websites mean that they know, for example, the 40% and 18% of the user's browsing history? And also, can we say something on timing? So how many tracking organizations, how fast and how frequently do users encounter them? So to measure the real impact of web tracking on users, we divided these studies in 2 parts. So the first part is about timings, where we try to answer questions like how many, how fast, and how frequently users encounter trackers. We also see whether there is any correlation between the number of visited websites and the organizations, the tracking organizations that are encountered. For example, is it true that if we visit more websites, we encounter more organizations? And also, how frequently do we re-encounter the same organization? In the second part, we will be talking about the knowledge of trackers. So how many websites, how many browsing history is actually known to tracking organizations, and if there is any strategy they can use to increase this knowledge. We will also see whether tracking organizations are interested in particular sensitive information and particular categories of websites, and also whether there is an optimal tracking strategy and whether some tracking organizations are following it. So to perform this study, we used Norton LifeLock telemetry, about 250K users in 214 countries. And for each of them, we have the day, the hour, and the domain only accessed by each user during 1 week for a total of 2.3 million distinct domains. What do we do is to build a custom crawler, visit each of the websites, and retrieve tracking organizations. And we count more than 6K tracking organizations in our dataset. So let's look a bit at the timing. We measured, to answer the first question, how many tracking on average a user encounters during 1 week. So the answer is, on average, 177. But the main point here is that only after 2 hours, 50% of them are already tracking the user. And this number raises to 84 in only 12 hours. And basically, after 1 day, the totality of tracking organizations are already tracking the user. And this brings us to the first main finding of this work, that is, no matter how many trackers do you encounter at the end of the week, well, almost all of them will know about you in a few browsing hours. For the second question, whether there is any correlation between a visited website and encounter trackers, well, this was quite straightforward. As you can see from this plot, there is almost a perfect correlation. So in this plot, each dot is a user, and on the x-axis, you have the number of visited websites. On the y-axis, you have the number of trackers encountered. But actually, what we were interested to find was a group of users that was not following this trend. And actually, what we did was to isolate the outliers of this plot. And we noticed that, for example, there is a group of users that is visiting a very few number of websites, but still encountering a higher number of trackers. And what we found is that those users visit very reputable websites, for example, news, sports websites that contain a lot of tracking organizations. We found also that for those users, the security of the website is higher, so they visit more secure websites. On the other hand, for the other group of outliers, it's completely the opposite, so they visit less reputable websites and less secure websites. To answer the third question, so how frequently do users encounter the same trackers? And also, this brings to another question. So is it possible to prevent web tracking by simply deleting the browsing history? And how frequently should we do it to avoid this? So here we have the top 5 tracking organizations in our dataset. And as you can see from the rightmost column, they track users with a frequency that is slightly above 1 hour. And I want to underline here that 1 hour is the finest granularity we have in our dataset. So probably this number is for sure much lower. And of course, as you can imagine, the conclusion is that if you want to prevent web tracking by simply deleting the browsing history, you should do it so fast that it's not a practical solution.
So now we are going to speak about the knowledge that these trackers have. So the next question will be how many visited websites are actually known for trackers, right? So first, Savino was talking about the different percentages, but here we see different because Google actually has 64% of the users' browsing history. But if we remember the first numbers that were commented in this presentation, this number was 40% if they were analyzing the top 1 million websites. The same situation happens with Facebook that originally had 30% of the browsing history even before this number was 18%. So we see here that an increase of 24% in the case of Google and 12% in the case of Facebook, which is quite a big number. Which actually comes to this conclusion, right? So users do not visit a random sample of the top 1 million websites, so analyzing it like this will actually always take us to an underestimation. Still, these are lower bounds, because the crawler visited websites and analyzed the specific domains. But these are not the only domains that they happen while the users are browsing, and there are many inter-domain connections that are not visible with a simple crawling. So we have to take into account this and come to the next question. How much can this knowledge increase when cooperating with them among different trackers? So we use the information that was already available from previous studies to see how the different tracking companies were sharing data between them. And we found that in our specific case, with two organizations sharing information between each other, they can increase this number 5 or 10%. But if we increase this number from 2 organizations to multiple organizations, this can increase up to 50% more. So just to give a couple of examples, here we have the graph that shows Facebook and Microsoft. So without sharing any information, Facebook was having this 30% that we're saying, and Microsoft has 27%. But if they start sharing this information between different companies, these numbers increase to 67% and 73%. So it's a large increase. And this happens because different tracking organizations, they don't track exactly in the same domains. So when they share, they are able to match this information and track the user in many more places. How much sensitive information is actually known to these trackers? So we take into consideration something as sensitive based on legal documents that explain this. And we see that political, health, sexuality, financial, religion, and legal are the ones that we are taking into account. And for example, we see that in health, 34% of all the tracking organizations that we see in our dataset are actually present in these categories, which is like 2.2K more or less. And political is actually an interesting case, because in this case we see 15 different organizations per website. So we see that there are many trackers interested in this category, and they are present in many of these websites. So we see here the graph that we see the different big trackers that we can see in our dataset and the different categories they are. We see a correlation between the information that they get, but still we see some categories such as the one political that we were discussing about that actually have a big more impact on the trackers, and they can track the people more. So the trackers follow this optimal tracking strategy. And what do we mean with optimal tracking strategy is that we run the top 5K websites that, based on our data set, are the most visited ones, so the ones that will allow these trackers to obtain more knowledge of the different users in our data set. And we see that Google is in 66% of those 5K websites, Facebook is in 35%, and Microsoft is in 17%. But does this mean actually that they can track the user based on these numbers? So this took us to analysis of how much they will know only with these 5K websites. So in the case that the tracker will be present in the 5K website that we are seeing as most important for our dataset, we see that they will already get 78% of the browsing history of the users, which is quite a big number. This number will be reduced to around 50% in the case of Google, so they are not in these 5K websites, but they're in a big chunk of them, so still they get like 50% of them. But then the most interesting case is here, where we have Microsoft and Facebook. So we're seeing the numbers before that they were like nearly double. So Microsoft was in many less of these 5K websites, but here still the knowledge that they will obtain is pretty similar. And this happens principally because Microsoft is on websites that are higher ranked, that the users are visiting most in these 5K, so the top part of these 5Ks, and Facebook is in the one that are lower bound in these 5K. So still they get very similar numbers, even if they are present in many less websites. So just to finish, we'll have to give some takeaways of this talk. So the first one is that the main web tracking actors know around 2/3, more or less, of the browsing history of the users, which is a big percentage. It's much more than what you estimated before analyzing the top 1 million. Users do not visit a random sample of these top 1 million websites because analyzing them will lead to an underestimation. And finally, no matter how many trackers you encounter at the end of the week, almost all of them know you just in a few hours of browsing. So thank you very much. We'll be happy to answer some questions.